Conclave. Chapter 12. The Fifth Ballot. In modern times they usually had a pope by the fifth ballot. The late Holy Father, for example, had got it on the fifth, and Lomeli could picture him now, resolutely refusing to sit on the papal throne, but insisting on standing up to embrace the cardinals as they queued to congratulate him. Ratzinger had won it one ballot earlier, when they'd voted for the fourth time. Lomeli remembered him, too, his shy smile as his tally reached 2/3 and the conclave burst into applause. John Paul I had also been a fourth ballot victor. In fact, apart from John Paul II, the fifth ballot rule held true at least as far back as 1963, when Montini had defeated Lecaro, and had famously remarked to his more charismatic rival, "That's how life is, Your Eminence. You should be sitting here." An election completed in 5 ballots was what Lomeli had secretly prayed for, a nice, easy, conventional number, suggestive of an election that had neither schism nor coronation, but a meditative process of discerning God's will. It would not be so this year. He did not like the feel of it. Studying for his doctorate in canon law at the Pontifical Lateran University, he'd read Canetti's Crowds and Power. From it he'd learnt to separate the various categories of crowd: the panicking crowd, the stagnant crowd, the crowd in revolt, and so forth. It was a useful skill for a cleric. Applying this secular analysis, a papal conclave could be seen as the most sophisticated crowd on earth, moved this way or that by the collective impulse of the Holy Spirit. Some conclaves were timid and disinclined to change, such as that which elected Ratzinger. Others were bold, like the one that eventually chose Wojtyla. What worried Lomeli about this particular conclave was that it was beginning to show signs of becoming what Canetti might call a disintegrating crowd. It was troubled, unstable, fragile, capable of suddenly heading off in any direction. That growing sense of purpose and excitement with which they had ended the morning session had evaporated. Now, as the cardinals filed up to vote and the small area of sky visible through the high windows darkened, the silence in the Sistine became bleak and tomb-like. The tolling of a bell of St. Peter's for 5 o'clock might have been the death knell at a funeral. We are lost sheep, Lomeli thought, and a great storm is approaching. But who will be our shepherd? He still thought the best choice was Bellini, and voted for him yet again, but without any expectation he would win. His tallies in the 4 ballots so far had been 18, 19, 10, and 18 respectively. Clearly something was preventing him breaking out beyond his core group of supporters. Perhaps it was because he'd been Secretary of State and was too closely associated with the late Holy Father, whose politics had both antagonized the traditionals and disappointed the liberals. He found his gaze returning repeatedly to Tremblay, the Canadian who was nervously fingering his pectoral cross as the voting proceeded. He managed somehow to combine a bland personality with passionate ambition, a paradox that was not uncommon in Lomeli's experience. But maybe blandness was what was needed to maintain the unity of the Church, and was ambition necessarily such a sin? Wojtyla had been ambitious. My God, how confident he'd been right from the start. On the night of his election, when he'd stepped onto the balcony to address the tens of thousands in St. Peter's Square, in his eagerness to speak to the world. If it comes to a cross between Tremblay and Tedesco, Lomeli thought, I shall have to vote for Tremblay, secret report or no. He could only pray it would not happen. The sky was entirely black by the time the last ballot was cast, and the scrutineers began to count the votes. The result was another shock. Tremblay, 40. Tedesco, 38. Bellini, 15. Lomeli, 12. Adeyemi, 9. Benitez, 4. As his colleagues turned to look at him, Tremblay bowed his head and placed his hands together in prayer. For once this ostentatious show of piety did not irritate Lomeli. Instead, he briefly closed his eyes and gave thanks. Thank you, O Lord, for the indication of your will, and if Cardinal Tremblay is to be our choice, I pray that you may grant him the wisdom and strength to fulfil his mission. Amen. It was with some relief that he stood and faced the conclave. My brothers, that concludes the 5th ballot. No candidate having achieved the necessary majority, we shall resume voting tomorrow morning. The masters of ceremonies will collect your papers. Please do not take any written notes out of the Sistine, and be careful not to discuss our deliberations until you are back inside the Casa Santa Marta. Would the Junior Cardinal Deacon please ask for the doors to be unlocked?" At 6:22 p.m, black smoke once again began to pour from the Sistine chimney, picked out by the searchlight mounted on the side of St. Peter's Basilica. The pundits hired by the television channels professed themselves surprised by the conclave's failure to agree. Most had predicted that the new pope would have been elected by now, and the US networks were on standby to interrupt their lunchtime schedules to show the scenes in St. Peter's Square as the victor appeared on the balcony. For the first time, the experts began to express doubts about the strength of Bellini's support. If he was going to win, he ought to have done so by now. A new collective wisdom began to rise out of the debris of the old, that the conclave was on the verge of making history. In the United Kingdom, that godless isle of apostasy, where the whole affair was being treated as a horse race, the Ladbrokes betting agency made Cardinal Adami the new favourite. Tomorrow, it was commonly said, might at last see the election of the first black pope. As usual, Lamelli was the last cardinal to leave the chapel. He stayed behind to watch Monsignor O'Malley burn the ballots, and then, together, they made their way across the Sala Regia. A security man trailed them down the staircase towards the courtyard. Lamelli assumed that O'Malley, as secretary of the college, would know the results of the afternoon ballots, if only because it was his task to collect the cardinal's notes in order to destroy them, and O'Malley was not the kind of man to avert his eyes from a secret. He must be aware, therefore, of the collapse of Adami's candidacy, and of the unexpected ascendancy of Tremblay. But he was too discreet to raise the subject directly. Instead, he said quietly, "Is there anything you'd like me to do before tomorrow morning, Your Eminence?" "Such as?" "I was wondering if perhaps you wanted me to go back to Monsignor Morales and see if I could discover any more about the withdrawn report into Cardinal Tremblay." "I don't know what would be the point of it, Ray. If he wouldn't say anything before the conclave started, he is hardly likely to do so now, particularly if he suspects Cardinal Tremblay might be about to be elected Pope. And that, of course, is exactly what he would suspect if you raised the matter for a second time." They emerged into the evening. The last of the minibuses had gone. Somewhere nearby a helicopter was hovering again, and Lamelli beckoned at the security guard and gestured to the deserted courtyard. "I seem to have been left behind. Would you mind?" "Of course, Your Eminence," the man whispered into his sleeve. Lamelli turned back to O'Malley. He felt weary and alone. He was seized by an unaccustomed desire to unburden himself. "Sometimes one can know too much, my dear Monsignor O'Malley. I mean, who among us does not have some secret of which he is ashamed? This ghastly business of shutting our eyes to sexual abuse, for example. I was in the Foreign Service, so was spared direct involvement myself, thank God. But I doubt I would have acted any more firmly. How many of our colleagues failed to take complaints of the victims seriously, but simply moved the priests responsible to a different parish? It wasn't that those who turned a blind eye were evil. It was simply they did not understand the scale of the wickedness they were dealing with, and preferred a quiet life. Now we know differently." He was silent for a moment, thinking of Sister Shanumi and her worn little photograph of her child. Oh, how many have had friendships that became too intimate and led on to sin and heartbreak. Or poor silly Totino and his wretched apartment. Without the family, one can so easily become obsessed with matters of status and protocol to give one a sense of fulfillment. So, tell me, am I supposed to go around like some witch-finder general, searching for my colleagues' lapses of more than 30 years ago? I agree, Your Eminence. Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone. However, I thought in the case of Cardinal Tremblay you were worried about something more recent, a meeting between the Holy Father and the Cardinal that took place last month. I was, but I am beginning to discover that the Holy Father, may he be joined forevermore to the fellowship of holy pontiffs, Amen. I am beginning to discover that the Holy Father may not have been entirely himself in the last few weeks of his life. Indeed, from what Cardinal Bellini has said to me, I gather he had become almost, I speak to you in absolute confidence, slightly paranoid, or at any rate very secretive, as witnessed by his decision to create a cardinal in pectore. Indeed, why in heaven's name did he do that? Let me say at once that I hold Cardinal Benitez in high esteem, as clearly do several of our brothers. He is a true man of God. But was it really necessary to elevate him in secret, and in such haste? Especially as he had only just tried to resign as Archbishop on the grounds of poor health. And yet he seems perfectly fit in mind and body to me. And last night when I asked after his health, he seemed surprised by the question. Listen to me, I sound like a typical old maid of a curia, gossiping in darkened corners about appointments. A minibus drove into the courtyard and pulled up opposite Lamelli. The driver opened the doors. There were no other passengers inside. A blast of hot air-conditioned air fanned their faces. Do you want a lift to the Casa Santa Marta? No, thank you, Your Eminence. I need to go back to the Sistine and put out fresh ballot papers, and make sure everything's ready for tomorrow. Well, then, good night, Ray. Good night, Your Eminence. O'Malley offered his hand to help Lamelli up to the coach, and for once Lamelli felt so tired he took it. Of course, I could undertake a little further investigation, if you would like me to. Into what? Cardinal Benitez. Thank you. No, I don't think so. I've heard enough secrets for one day. Let God's will be done, preferably quickly. When he reached the Casa Santa Marta, Lamelli went straight to the elevator. It was just before 7 o'clock. He held the door open long enough to allow the Archbishops of Stuttgart and Prague, Lowenstein and Janicek, to join him. The Czech was leaning on his stick, grey-faced with fatigue. As the door closed and the car began to rise, Lowenstein said, "Well, Dean, do you think we will finish this by tomorrow night?" "Perhaps, Your Eminence. It's not in my hands." If it drags on much longer, I wonder what the actuarial odds are that one of us will die before we find a new pope. You might mention that to a few of your colleagues. It may concentrate their minds. This is my floor, excuse me. He stepped out of the elevator, past the votive candles outside the Holy Father's apartment, and walked along the dimly lit corridor. From behind several of the closed doors he could hear showers running. When he reached his room, he hesitated, then went a few paces on and stood outside a dais. Not a sound came from within. The contrast between this deep silence and the laughter and excitement of the previous evening was awful to him. He felt appalled by the brutal necessity of his own actions. "Joshua, it's Lamelli. Are you all right?" No reply. His own room had again been tidied by the nuns. He sat on the edge of the bed and loosened his shoelaces. His back ached. His eyes were swimming with tiredness. Yet he knew that if he lay down he would fall asleep, so he went to his prie-dieu, knelt, and opened his breviary to the readings of the day. His eye fell immediately upon Psalm 46. "Come, behold the works of the Lord. See what desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire." As he meditated, he began to experience the same premonition of violent chaos that had almost overcome him during the morning session in the Sistine Chapel. He saw for the first time how God willed destruction, that it was inherent in his creation from the beginning, and that they could not escape it. He would come among them in wrath. See what desolations he has brought on the earth. He gripped the sides of his prie-dieu so hard that in a few minutes, when someone rapped loudly on the door behind him, his entire body seemed to jolt, as if he'd had an electric shock. "Wait!" He hauled himself to his feet and briefly put his hand on his heart. It kicked against his fingers like a trapped animal. Was this how it had felt for the Holy Father just before he died? Sudden palpitations had turned into an iron band of pain. He took a few moments to gather his composure before he opened the door. Standing in the corridor were Bellini and Sabadin. Bellini stared at him in concern. "Forgive us, Jacopo. Are we disturbing your prayers?" "It is of no consequence. I am sure God will excuse us. Are you not well?" "No, not at all. Come in." He stood aside to let them enter. As usual, the Archbishop of Milan looked as professionally mournful as an undertaker, although he brightened when he saw the size of Lomeli's room. "Dear me, this is tiny. We both have suites. It's not so much the lack of space as the lack of light and air I find oppressive. It's giving me nightmares. Let us pray it will not be for too much longer. Amen." "That is what we've come about. Please." Lomeli cleared some of his things from the bed and draped them over the prie-dieu to allow his visitors to sit down. He pulled out the chair from the desk and turned it round so that he was sitting facing them. "I'd offer you a drink, but foolishly, unlike Gattuso, I failed to bring in my own supplies. It won't take long. I simply wanted to let you know that I have come to a conclusion that I do not have sufficient support among our colleagues to be elected Pope." "Well, don't be so sure, Aldo. It isn't over yet." "You're kind. I'm afraid, as far as I'm concerned, it is over. I have had a very loyal cohort of supporters, among whom I have been touched to number you, Jacopo, despite the fact that I replaced you as Secretary of State, for which you would have had every right to harbour a grudge. I have never wavered in my belief that you are the best man for the job." Yeah. "Oh, please, dear friends, don't make it any harder. The question now arises, given that I cannot win, whom should I advise my supporters to vote for? In the first ballot I voted for Van Drucksenbach, the greatest theologian of his age, in my opinion, even though, of course, he never stood a chance. But in the last 4 ballots, Jacopo, I have voted for you." "My dear Aldo, I don't know what to say." "I should be happy to continue to, and tell my colleagues to do the same. But, well—" "You can't win either," said Sabadin with brutal finality. He opened his black notebook. "Aldo got 15 votes in the last ballot, you got 12. But even if we delivered you of all our 15 in a block, which frankly we can't, you'd still only be in 3rd place, behind Tremblay and Tedesco. The Italians are divided, as usual. Since we 3 agree that the Patriarch of Venice will be a disaster, the logic of the situation is clear. The only viable option is Tremblay. Our combined total of 27 plus his 40 makes it 67. That means he only needs another 12 to win a 2/3 majority. If he doesn't get them on the next ballot, my feeling is he'll probably get them on the one after that. Do you agree, Lomeli?" "I do. Unfortunately, I am no more of an enthusiast for Tremblay than you are. But even so, we have to face the fact that he has demonstrated broad appeal, and if we believe that the Holy Spirit is operating through the Conclave, we have to accept that God, improbable as it may seem, wishes us to give the keys of St. Peter to Joe Tremblay." "Perhaps he does. Although it's strange that until lunchtime he also seemed to want us to give them to Joshua Ademi." Lomeli glanced at the wall. He wondered if the Nigerian was listening. "Can I add I am also troubled by this, by the 3 of us meeting in collusion to try to influence the result. It seems a sacrilege. All we need is the Patriarch of Lisbon with his cigars, and we'd be in a smoke-filled room like the American political convention. And let us not forget, it is our duty before God to vote for the candidate we think should be elected. It is not enough for us to vote for the least worst option. Oh, with respect, Dean, that is sophistry. On the first ballot, you can take the purest view. Good, fine. But by the time we reach the 4th or 5th, our personal favourite is likely to have long gone. We are obliged to choose from a narrowed field, and that process of concentration is the whole function of a conclave. Otherwise nobody would change their minds, and we would be here for weeks." "Which is what Tedesco wants." I know, you are right. I came to the same conclusion myself in the Sistine this afternoon. Yet—" He sat forward in his chair, rubbing his palms together, trying to decide if he should tell them what he knew. There is one other thing you ought to be aware of. Just before the conclave began, Archbishop Wozniak came to see me, and he said that the Holy Father had fallen out badly with Tremblay, to such an extent he was intending to dismiss him from all offices of the Church. Had either of you picked up on this story? It is news to us. Do you believe it true? I don't know. I put the allegation to Tremblay in person. Naturally, he denied it. He blamed the rumour on Wozniak's drinking. Well, that is possible. And yet it cannot be entirely a figment of his imagination. Why? Because I discovered afterwards that there was a report of some kind into Tremblay, but it was withdrawn. There was a moment's silence as they considered this. Saladin turned to Bellini. If there had been such a report, surely as Secretary of State you would have heard of it. Not necessarily. You know how this place works. The Holy Father could be very secretive. Another silence. It went on perhaps half a minute, until at last Saladin spoke. We'll never find a candidate who doesn't have some kind of black mark against his name. We've had a pope who was a member of the Hitler Youth and fought for the Nazis. We've had popes who were accused of having colluded with communists and fascists, or who ignored reports of the most appalling abuses. Where does it end? If you've been a member of the Curia, you can be sure someone will have leaked something about you. And if you've been an archbishop, you're bound to have made a mistake at one time or another. We're mortal men. We serve an ideal. We cannot always be ideal. It sounded like a rehearsed speech for the defence, so much so that for a moment Lamelli entertained the unworthy thought that perhaps Saladin had already approached Tremblay and offered to try to secure him the papacy in return for some future preferment. He would not put it past the Archbishop of Milan. He had never concealed his ambition to be Secretary of State. But in the end all he said was, "That was very well put. So are we agreed, Jacopo? I shall talk to my supporters, and you will talk to yours, and we will both urge them to support Tremblay." "I suppose so. Not that I actually know who my supporters are, apart from you and Benitez." "Benitez? Ah, now, there's an interesting fellow. I can't make him out at all. And yet he got 4 votes on the last ballot. Where on earth are they coming from? You might have a word with him, Dean, and see if you can persuade him to our point of view. Those 4 votes might make all the difference." Lamelli agreed that he would try to see Benitez before dinner. He would go to his room. It was not the sort of conversation he wished to be seen having in front of other cardinals. Half an hour later, Lamelli took the elevator to the 6th floor, Block B. He recalled Benitez telling him that his room was at the top of the hotel, in the wing facing the city. Now he was there, he realized he did not know the number. He wandered the corridor, examining the dozen identical closed doors, until he heard voices behind him and turned to see 2 cardinals emerging. One was Gambino, the Archbishop of Perugia, acting as one of Tedesco's unofficial campaign managers. The other was Adeyemi. They were in the middle of a conversation. "I'm sure he can be persuaded," Gambino was saying, and at that moment they saw Lamelli and stopped talking. "Are you lost, Dean?" "I am, as a matter of fact. I was looking for Cardinal Benitez." "Oh, the new boy. Are you plotting, Your Eminence?" "No, no more than anyone else." "Oh, then you are plotting. I think you'll find he's in the end room on the left." As Gambino turned away and pressed the button for the elevator, Adeyemi lingered for a fraction longer, staring at Lamelli. "You think I'm finished," his face seemed to say, "but you can spare me your pity, for I am not without some power, even yet." Then he joined Gambino in the elevator. The doors closed, and Lamelli was left staring at the empty space. Adeyemi's influence had been entirely overlooked in their calculations. The Nigerian had still received 9 votes in the last ballot, even though by then his candidacy was plainly doomed. If he could deliver even half of those diehards to Tedesco, then the Patriarch of Venice would be assured of his blocking third. A thought energized him. He strode along the corridor and knocked firmly on the end door. After a few moments he heard Benitez call out, "Who is it?" "It is Lomeli." The lock slid back and the door half opened. "Your Eminence?" Benitez was clutching his unbuttoned cassock together at his throat. His thin brown feet were bare, the room behind him in darkness. "I am sorry to interrupt while you are dressing. May I have a word?" "Of course. One moment." Benitez disappeared back into the room. His wariness struck Lomeli as odd, but then he thought that if he had lived in some of the places this man had, doubtless he too would have got into the habit of not opening his door without first checking who was there. Along the corridor, 2 other cardinals had appeared and were preparing to go down to dinner. They glanced in his direction. He raised his hand. Benitez opened the door wide. He'd finished dressing. "Come in, Dean." He switched on the light. "Excuse me. At this time of day I always try to meditate for an hour." Lomeli followed him into the room. It was small, identical to his own, dotted with a dozen flickering candles. On the nightstand, on the desk, beside the prie-dieu, even in the darkened bathroom. "In Africa I got used to not always having electricity. Now I find that candles have become essential for me when I pray alone. The sisters kindly found me a few. There is something about the quality of the light. It is interesting. I must see if it helps me." "You have difficulty praying?" Lomeli was surprised by the bluntness of the question. "Sometimes, especially lately." His hand moved a vague circle in the air. "I have too much on my mind. Perhaps I could be of assistance." For a brief instant Lomeli was affronted. Was he, a former Secretary of State and Dean of the College of Cardinals, to be given lessons in how to pray? But the offer was clearly sincere, so he found himself saying, "Yes, I would like that. Thank you." "Sit, please." Benitez pulled out the chair from the desk. "Will it disturb you if I finish getting ready while we talk?" No, go ahead." Lomeli watched the Filipino as he sat on the bed and pulled on his socks. He was struck afresh by how young and trim he looked for a man of 67, boyish almost, with his lock of jet-black hair spilling like ink across his face as he bent forward. For Lomeli, these days, putting on a pair of socks could take 10 minutes, yet the Filipino's limbs and fingers seemed as lithe and nimble as a 20-year-old's. Perhaps he practised yoga by candlelight as well as praying. He remembered why he'd come. "The other night you were kind enough to say you had voted for me." "I did." "I don't know whether you've continued to do so, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But if you have, I want to repeat my plea to you to stop, only this time I make the plea with even greater urgency." "Why?" "First, because I lack the necessary spiritual depth to be Pope. Secondly, because I can't possibly win. You must understand, Your Eminence, this conclave is poised on a knife edge. If we don't reach a decision tomorrow, the rules are very clear. Voting will have to be suspended for a day so we can reflect on the impasse. Then we try again for 2 days. Then we stop for another day. And so on until 12 days have passed and a total of 30 ballots have been held. Only after that can the new Pope be elected by simple majority." "So, what is the problem?" "But I would have thought it obvious. The damage such a long drawn-out process would do to the Church." "Damage? I don't understand." Was he naive, Lomeli wondered, or disingenuous? Well, 12 successive days of balloting and discussion, all of it in secret, with half the world's media camped in Rome, would be seen as proof that the Church is in crisis, that it cannot agree on a leader to guide it through these difficult times. It would also, frankly, strengthen that faction of our colleagues who want to take the Church back to an earlier era. In my worst nightmares, to speak absolutely freely, I wonder if a prolonged conclave would herald the start of a great schism that has been threatening us for nearly 60 years. So, I take it you have come to ask me to vote for Cardinal Tremblay." Well, he was sharper than he seemed, thought Lomeli. "That would be my advice. And if you know the identities of the cardinals who have voted for you, I would also ask you to consider advising them to do the same. Do you know who they are, as a matter of interest?" I suspect 2 of them are my fellow countrymen, Cardinal Mendoza and Cardinal Ramos, even though, like you, I have begged everyone not to support me. Cardinal Tremblay has spoken to me about this, in fact. Oh, I'm sure he has. He at once regretted his sarcasm. You want me to vote for a man you regard as ambitious. Benitez looked at Lamelli, a long, hard, appraising look that made him feel quite uncomfortable, and then, without speaking further, began putting on his shoes. Lamelli shifted in his seat. He didn't care for this lengthening silence. I am assuming, of course, because of your obviously close relationship with the Holy Father, that you do not want to see Cardinal Tedesco as Pope. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps you believe in the same things he does. Benitez finished tying his shoelaces and placed his feet on the floor. He looked up again. I believe in God, Your Eminence, and in God alone, which is why I don't share your alarm at the idea of a long conclave, or even a schism come to that. Who knows? Perhaps that is what God wants. It would explain why our conclave is proving to be such a conundrum that even you cannot solve it. A schism would go against everything I believe in and I have worked for throughout my entire life. Which is what? The divine gift of the single universal church. And this unity of an institution is worth preserving even at the price of breaking one's sacred oath? That is an extraordinary allegation. The church is not merely an institution, as you call it. It is the living embodiment of the Holy Spirit. Well, here we differ. I feel I am more likely to encounter the embodiment of the Holy Spirit elsewhere. For example, in those 2 million women who have been raped as an act of military policy in the civil wars of Central Africa. Lamelli was so taken aback it was a moment before he could reply. I can assure you, I would never for a moment countenance breaking my oath to God, whatever the consequences for the Church. The evening bell rang, a long jangling note like a fire alarm, to signal dinner was being served. Benitez stood and extended his hand. I meant no offence, Dean. I am sorry if I have given it. But I cannot vote for a man unless he is the one I deem most worthy to be Pope. For me, that man is not Cardinal Tremblay. It is you. How many times more, Your Eminence? Lamelli struck the side of his chair in frustration. I do not want your vote. Nevertheless, you have it. Benitez stretched out his hand further. Come, let us be friends. Shall we go to dinner together? Lamelli sulked a few more seconds, then sighed and allowed himself to be helped from the chair. He watched as Benitez went round the room blowing out the candles. The extinguished wicks spurted thin black tendrils of pungent smoke, and the smell of the burnt wax carried Lamelli in an instant back to his days in the seminary, when he would read by candlelight in the dormitory after lights out and pretend to be asleep when the priest came to check. He went into the bathroom, licked his thumb and forefinger, and snuffed out the candle beside the wash-basin. As he did so, he noticed the little kit of toiletries that O'Malley had provided for Benitez on the night of his arrival: a toothbrush, a small tube of toothpaste, a bottle of deodorant, and a plastic disposable razor, still in its cellophane wrapper. Chapter 13. The Inner Sanctum. That night, as they consumed the third dinner of their imprisonment, some undefinable fish in caper sauce, a new and febrile mood took hold of the conclave. The cardinals were a sophisticated electorate. They could do the math, as Paul Korinsky, the Archbishop Emeritus of Chicago, was going round urging them. They could see that this had now become a 2-horse race between Tedesco and Tremblay. Between unyielding principle on the one hand and yearning for compromise on the other, between a conclave that might drag on for another 10 days and one that would probably end the following morning, the factions worked for room accordingly. Tedesco from the start took up a position alongside Deamy on the table of African cardinals. As usual, he held his plate in one hand and hoisted food into his mouth with the other, occasionally pausing to stab the air with his fork as he made a point. Lamelli, who was seated in his customary position of the Italian contingent, didn't need to hear what he was saying to know that he was expounding on his familiar theme of the moral decay of Western liberal societies, and to judge by his listeners' solemnly nodding heads, he was finding a receptive audience. Tremblay, meanwhile, ate his main course on a table of fellow French speakers. His campaigning technique was the opposite of Tedesco's, who liked to gather a circle around him and lecture them. Instead, Tremblay spent the evening moving from group to group, seldom staying more than a few seconds with each, shaking hands, squeezing shoulders, indulging in general bonhomie with this cardinal, exchanging whispered confidences with that. He did not seem to have a campaign manager as such, but Lamelli had already overheard several of the coming men, such as Modesto, the Archbishop of Toledo, announcing in loud voices that Tremblay was the only possible victor. From time to time Lamelli allowed his gaze to drift to the others. Bellini was sitting in a far corner. He seemed to have given up trying to influence the undecided, and was indulging himself for once by taking his meal with his fellow theologians, Van Drugenberg and Lowenstein. As for Benitez, the moment he'd arrived in the dining room, he'd been invited to join the Anglophones. Lamelli couldn't see the Filipino's face, he had his back to him, but he could observe the expressions of his companions. Newby of Westminster, Fitzgerald of Boston, Santos of Galveston, Rudgard of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Like the Africans of Tedesco, they seemed to be engrossed in what their guest was saying. And all the while, between the tables, carrying trays and bottles of wine, moved the blue-habited, downcast-eyed nuns of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. Lamelli was familiar with the ancient orders from his years as a nuncio. It was run from a mother house in the Rue de Bac in Paris. He'd visited it twice. Its members had not given up their lives in order to become waitresses for cardinals. Its charism was supposed to be service to the poor. On Lamelli's table the mood was sombre. Unless they could bring themselves to vote for Tedesco, which they all agreed they couldn't, they were in the process of gradually reconciling themselves to the fact that they would probably never again see an Italian pope in their lifetimes. The conversation was desultory all evening, and Lamelli was too preoccupied with his thoughts to pay it much attention. His dialogue with Benitez had disturbed him profoundly. He was unable to get it out of his mind. Was it really possible that he'd spent the last 30 years worshipping the Church rather than God? Because that, in essence, was the accusation Benitez had levelled against him. In his heart he could not escape the truth of it. The sin, the heresy. Was it any wonder he found it so difficult to pray? It was an epiphany, similar to that which had struck him in St. Peter's while he was waiting to deliver his sermon. Finally he could stand it no longer and pushed back his chair. "My brothers, I fear I have been dull company. I think I shall go to bed." "Oh, good night, Dean." Lamelli walked towards the lobby. Few noticed him, and of those few none would have guessed from his dignified tread the clamour resounding in his head. At the last minute, instead of going upstairs, his footsteps suddenly swerved away from the staircase towards the reception desk. He asked the nun behind the counter if Sister Agnes was still on duty. It was around 9:30 p.m. Behind him in the dining room, dessert was just being served. When Sister Agnes appeared from her office, something in her manner suggested she'd been expecting him. Her handsome face was sharp and pale, her eyes a crystalline blue. "Your Eminence?" "Sister Agnes, good evening. I was wondering if it might be possible for me to have another word with Sister Shanumi." "That is impossible, I'm afraid." "Why?" "She's on her way home to Nigeria." "My goodness, that was quick." "There was an Ethiopian Airlines flight to Lagos from Fiumicino this evening. I thought it would be best for all concerned if she was on it." Her eyes held his, unblinking. "Perhaps, in that case, I might have a private talk with you." "Surely we are having a private talk at the moment, Your Eminence." "Yes, but perhaps we might continue it in your office." She was reluctant. She said she was about to go off duty, but in the end she led him round the back of a reception desk and into her little glass cell. The blinds were down. The only light came from a desk lamp. On the table was an old-fashioned radio cassette machine playing a Gregorian chant. He recognized Alma Redemptoris Mater, loving Mother of our Saviour. The evidence of her piety touched him. That ancestor of hers, martyred during the French Revolution, had been beatified, he remembered. She turned off the music, and he closed the door behind them. They both remained standing. "How did Sister Shanami come to be in Rome?" "I have no idea, Your Eminence." "But the poor woman did not even speak Italian. She'd never left Nigeria before. She can't simply have turned up here without someone causing it to happen." "I received notification from the office of the Superioress General that she would be joining us. The arrangements were made in Paris. You should ask for Rudebach, Your Eminence." "I would, except, as you know, I am sequestered for the duration of the conclave." "Well, you can ask afterwards. The information is of value to me now." She stared him out with those indomitable blue eyes. She could be guillotined or burnt at the stake. She would not yield. If I had ever married, he thought, I would have wanted a wife like this. "Did you love the Holy Father, Sister Agnes?" "Of course." "Well, I certainly know he had a special regard for you. In fact, I think he was rather in awe of you." "I don't know about that." Her tone was dismissive. She knew what he was doing, and yet a certain part of her could not help but be flattered. For the first time her gaze flickered slightly. "And I believe he may have had some small regard for me as well. At any rate, let us say that when I tried to resign as dean, he would not let me. I could not understand why at the time. To be honest, I was angry with him. May God forgive me. Yet now I believe I understand. I think he sensed he was dying, and for some reason he wanted me to run this conclave. And with constant prayer, that is what I am trying to do. For him. Therefore, when I say I need to know why Sister Shinomi came to the Casa Santa Marta, I am asking not for myself, but on behalf of our late mutual friend, the Pope." "You say that, Your Eminence? How do I know what he would have wanted me to do?" "Ask him, Sister Agnes. Ask God." For at least a minute she did not reply. Eventually she said, "I promised the Superioress I would not say anything. I shan't say anything. You understand?" She put on a pair of spectacles, sat at her computer terminal, and began to type with great rapidity. It was a curious sight. Lamelli would never forget it. The elderly aristocratic nun peering closely at the screen, her fingers flying as if by their own volition across the grey plastic keyboard. The percussive blur of clicks built to a crescendo, slowed, became single beats, until with a final aggressive stab she lifted her hands, stood, and moved away from the desk to the other side of the office. Lamelli took her seat. On the screen was an email from the Superioress herself, dated 3rd of October, 2 weeks before the Holy Father died, he noted, and marked "in confidence," and reporting the immediate transfer to Rome of Sister Shanomi. "My dear Agnes, between us both, and not for public consumption, I would be grateful if you would take particular care of our sister, as her presence has been requested by the prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, His Eminence Cardinal Tremblay." After saying good night to Sister Agnes, Lamelli retraced his steps and returned to the dining room. He queued for coffee and carried it to the lobby. There he sat in one of the overstuffed crimson armchairs with his back to the reception desk, and waited and watched. Ah, he thought, but he was something, this Cardinal Tremblay. A North American who was not an American, a French speaker who was not a Frenchman, a doctrinal liberal who was also a social conservative, or was it the other way round? A champion of the Third World, and the epitome of the First. How foolishly Lamelli had underestimated him. Already he noticed the Canadian did not have to fetch his own coffee any more. Sabadin collected it on his behalf, and then the Archbishop of Milan accompanied Tremblay over to a group of Italian cardinals, who deferred to him at once, widening their circle to admit him. Lamelli sipped his coffee and bided his time. He wanted there to be no witnesses to what he needed to do. Occasionally a cardinal would come over to speak to him. He would smile up at them, exchange a few pleasantries. Nothing in his face betrayed the agitation in his mind. But he found that if he did not stand, they soon took the hint and moved away. One by one they began making their way up to bed. It was almost 11 p.m., and most of the conclave had retired for the evening when Tremblay finally ended his conversation with the Italians. He raised his hand in what could almost have been interpreted as a benediction. Several of the cardinals bowed slightly. He turned away, smiling to himself, and walked towards the stairs. Immediately Lomeli tried to intercept him. There was a moment of near comedy as he discovered his legs had stiffened and he could barely get up from the chair. But after a struggle he managed to rise and limp on stiff legs in pursuit. He caught the Canadian just as he put his foot on the bottom step of the staircase. "Your Eminence, a word, if I may." Tremblay, still smiling, exuded benignity. "Hello, Dean. I was just on my way to bed. It really won't take a moment. Come." The smile remained, but a wariness appeared in Tremblay's eyes. Nevertheless, when Lomeli gestured to him to follow, he did, the length of the lobby, around the corner and into the chapel. The annex was deserted and in semi-darkness. Behind the toughened glass, the spotlit Vatican wall glowed greenish-blue, like an opera set for midnight assignation, or murder. The only other illumination came from the lamps above the altar. Lomeli crossed himself. Tremblay did the same. "This is mysterious. What is it?" "It is quite simple. I want you to withdraw your name from the next ballot." "What?" Tremblay peered at him, still apparently amused rather than alarmed. "Are you feeling all right, Jacopo?" "I'm sorry, but you are not the right man to be Pope." "That may be your opinion. 40 of our colleagues disagree, only because they do not know you as I do. This is very sad. I've always valued your level-headed wisdom. But ever since we entered the conclave, you seem to have become quite disturbed. I shall pray for you. I think you would do better to save your prayers for your own soul. I know 4 things about you, Your Eminence, that our colleagues do not. First, I know there was some kind of report into your activities. Second, I know that the Holy Father raised the matter with you only hours before he died. Third, I know that he dismissed you from all your posts. And fourth, I now know why." In the bluish half-light, Tremblay's face seemed suddenly stupefied. He looked as if he'd been struck a heavy blow on the back of his head. He sat down quickly on the nearest chair. He said nothing for a while, just stared straight ahead, at the crucifix suspended above the altar. Lomeli took the seat directly behind him. He leaned forward and spoke quietly into Tremblay's ear. "You are a good man, Joe, I am sure of it. You wish to serve God to the fullness of your abilities. Unfortunately, you believe these abilities are equal to the papacy. I have to tell you they are not. I am speaking as a friend." "A friend?" Tremblay kept his back to him. "Yes, truly. But I am also the dean of the college, and as such I have responsibilities. For me not to act on what I know would be a mortal sin." "And what exactly is it you know that isn't mere gossip?" "That somehow, I assume through your contacts with our missions in Africa, you discovered the story of Cardinal Adame's grave surrender to temptation 30 years ago, and you arranged for the woman involved to be brought to Rome." Tremblay didn't move at first. When at last he did turn round, he was frowning, as if trying to remember something. "How do you know about her?" "Never mind that. What matters is you brought her to Rome with the express intention of destroying Adame's chances of becoming Pope." "I deny that accusation absolutely." Now think carefully before you speak, Your Eminence." Lomeli held up a warning finger. "We are in a consecrated place." "You may bring me a Bible to swear on if you like. I still deny it." "Let me be clear. You deny asking the superioress of the Daughters of Charity to transfer one of her sisters to Rome?" "No, I asked her, but not on my own behalf." "On whose behalf, then?" "The Holy Father's." Lomeli drew back in disbelief. To save your candidacy, you would libel the Holy Father in his own chapel? It is not libel, it is the truth. The Holy Father gave me the name of a sister in Africa, and he asked me as prefect for the evangelization of peoples to make a private request to the Daughters of Charity to bring her to Rome. I asked no questions. I merely obliged him. It's very hard to believe. Well, it's true, and quite frankly, I'm shocked you should think otherwise. He stood. All his old self-assurance had returned. Now he looked down on Lomeli. I shall pretend this conversation never took place. Lomeli pushed himself up on his feet. It took an effort to keep the anger out of his voice. Unfortunately, it has taken place, and unless you indicate tomorrow that you no longer wish to be considered for the papacy, I shall make it known to the conclave that the Holy Father's last official act was to dismiss you for attempting to blackmail a colleague. And with what proof will you back up that ridiculous assertion? There is none. May I advise you, Jacopo, and I too speak here as a friend, not to repeat such malicious allegations to our colleagues. Your own ambition has not gone unnoticed. It might be seen as a tactic to blacken the name of another rival. It could even have entirely the opposite effect of the one you intend. Remember how the traditionalists tried to destroy Cardinal Montini in 63? 2 days later he was Pope. Tremblay genuflected at the altar, crossed himself, wished Lomeli a cold good night, and walked out of the chapel, leaving the Dean of the College of Cardinals to listen to the dwindling echo of his footsteps on the marble floor. For the next few hours Lomeli lay on his bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. The only source of light shone from the bathroom. Through the partition wall came the sound of Adeyemi snoring, but this time Lomeli was so preoccupied with his thoughts he barely heard him. In his hands he held the pass-key Sister Agnes had lent him on the morning he'd returned to the Casa Santa Marta after the Mass in St. Peter's, when he discovered he'd locked himself out of his room. He turned it over and over between his fingers, praying and talking to himself at the same time, so that the two merged into a single monologue. O Lord, you have charged me with the care of the most sacred conclave. Is it my duty merely to arrange my colleagues' deliberations, or do I have a responsibility to intervene and affect the outcome? I am your servant, and I dedicate myself to your will. The Holy Spirit will surely lead us to a worthy pontiff, regardless of any actions I may take. Guide me, Lord, I beg you. Help me fulfill your wishes. Servant, you must guide yourself. Twice he rose from the bed and went to the door, and twice he returned and lay down again. Of course he knew there would be no flash of insight, no sudden infusion of certainty. He did not expect one. God did not work that way. He'd sent him all the signs he needed. It was for him to act upon them. And perhaps he'd always suspected that he would have to do so in the end, which was why he never returned the pass-key, but had kept it in the drawer of the nightstand. He got up a third time and opened the door. According to the Apostolic Constitution, no one was to be left in the Casa Santa Marta after midnight, apart from the cardinals. The nuns were taken back to their quarters. The security men were either in the parked cars or patrolling the perimeter. In the Palazzo San Carlo, barely 50 metres away, 2 doctors were on standby. Should an emergency arise, medical or otherwise, the cardinals were supposed to press the fire alarms. Satisfied that the corridor was deserted, Lomeli walked quickly towards the landing. Outside the Holy Father's apartment, the votive candles flickered in their red glasses. He contemplated the door. For the final time he hesitated. Whatever I do for you. You see my heart, you know my intentions are pure. I commend myself to your protection. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened inwards a fraction. The ribbons, affixed by Tremblay with such speed after the Holy Father's death, tautened, preventing it from opening fully. Lomeli studied the seals. The red wax discs bore the coat of arms of the Apostolic Camera. crossed keys beneath an unfurled parasol. Their function was purely symbolic. They would not survive an instant's pressure. He pushed the door harder. The wax cracked and broke, the ribbons came free, and the way into the papal apartment was open. He crossed himself, stepped over the threshold, and closed the door behind him. The place smelled stale and airless. He felt around for the light switch. The familiar sitting-room looked exactly as it had on the night the Holy Father died. The lemon-coloured curtains tightly drawn, the scalloped-back blue sofa and 2 armchairs, the coffee table, the prodeo, the desk with the Pope's battered black leather briefcase propped beside it. He sat at the desk and picked up the briefcase, resting it on his knees, and he opened it. Inside was an electric razor, a tin of peppermints, a breviary, and a paperback copy of The Imitation of Christ. It was famously, according to the report issued by the Vatican Press Office, the last book the Holy Father had been reading before his heart attack. The page he had been studying was marked with a yellowing bus ticket, issued in his home city more than 20 years before. Of the dangers of intimacy. Do not tell others what is on your mind, but seek advice from someone who is wise and fears God. Keep company with young people or strangers sparingly. Do not admire the wealthy and avoid the company of celebrities. It is better to keep company with the poor and simple, the devout and the virtuous. He closed the book, put everything back in the briefcase and replaced it where he'd found it. He tried the central desk drawer. It was unlocked. He pulled it all the way out, placed it on the desk, and rummaged through the contents. The spectacles case, empty, a plastic bottle of lens cleaner, pencils, a box of aspirin, a pocket calculator, rubber bands, a penknife, an old leather wallet containing a €10 note, a copy of the latest Annuario Pontifico, a thick red-bound directory listing every major office holder in the church. He slid open the other 3 drawers. Apart from signed postcards of the Holy Father that he used to give to visitors, there was no paper of any kind. He sat back and considered this. Although the Pope had refused to live in the traditional papal apartment, he'd made use of his predecessor's office in the Apostolic Palace. He used to walk to it every morning carrying his briefcase, and invariably he brought work home with him to study in the evening. The burdens of the papacy were never ending. Lamelli clearly remembered being with him when he was signing letters and documents in this very seat. Either he had given up work entirely in his final days, or the desk must have been cleaned out, no doubt by the ever-efficient hand of his private secretary, Monsignor Morales. He stood and walked around the room, summoning the will to open the bedroom door. The sheets had been stripped from the massive antique bed. The pillows had no covers. But the Pope's spectacles and alarm clock were still on the nightstand, and when he opened the closet, 2 white cassocks hung ghost-like from the rail. The sight of these simple garments, the Holy Father had refused to wear the more elaborate papal vestments, seemed to break something inside Lamelli that had been pent up since the funeral. He put his hand to his eyes and bowed his head. His body shook, although no tears came. This dry convulsion lasted barely half a minute, and when it passed he felt curiously strengthened. He waited until he had recovered his breath, then turned and contemplated the bed. It was formidably ugly, centuries old, with big square posts at all 4 corners and carved panels at the head and foot. Alone of all the fine furniture to which he was entitled in the papal apartment, the Holy Father had chosen to have this ungainly object shipped to the Casa Santa Marta. Popes had slept in it for generations. To get it through the outer door must have required taking it apart and reassembling it. Carefully, as he had on the night the Pope died, Lamelli lowered himself to his knees, clasped his hands together, closed his eyes, and rested his forehead on the edge of the mattress to pray. Suddenly the terrible solitariness of the old man's life seemed almost too unbearable to contemplate. He reached out his arms in either direction along the wooden frame of the bed and gripped it. How long he remained in this position he could not afterwards say with certainty. It might have been 2 minutes, it might have been 20. What he was quite sure of was that at some point during this time the Holy Father entered his mind and spoke to him. Of course, it could have been a trick of the imagination. The rationalists had an explanation for everything, even for inspiration. All he knew was that before he knelt he was in despair, and afterwards, when he scrambled to his feet and stared at the bed, the dead man had told him what to do. His first thought was that there must be a concealed drawer. He got back down on his knees and went round feeling under the frame, but his hands encountered only empty space. He tried lifting the mattress, even though he knew it was a waste of time. The Holy Father, who beat Bellini at chess most evenings, would not have done anything so obvious. Finally, when all other options were exhausted, he contemplated the bedposts. First he tried the one to the right of the headboard. Its top was a dome of thick, dark-polished oak. At a casual glance it appeared to be all of a piece with its heavy support. But when he ran his fingers around the beading, one of the small carved discs felt slightly loose. He switched on the bedside lamp, climbed up onto the mattress, and examined it. Cautiously he pressed it. Nothing seemed to happen. But when he grasped the bedpost so he could swing his feet back down to the floor, the top came away in his hand. Beneath it was an empty cavity, with a flat, unvarnished wooden base, in the centre of which, so small as to be barely noticeable, was a tiny wooden knob. He grasped it between thumb and forefinger, pulled, and slowly withdrew a plain wooden case. There was a wonderful exactness to how it fitted. Fully extracted, it was about the size of a shoebox. He shook it. Something rustled within. He sat down on the mattress and slid off the cover. Inside, rolled up, were a few dozen documents. He flattened them out. Columns of figures, bank statements, money transfers, apartment addresses. Most of the pages had penciled notations on them in the Holy Father's tiny, angular handwriting. Suddenly, his own name jumped out at him. Lomeli, underlined. Apartment number 2, Palace of the Holy Office. 445 square meters! Exclamation mark, underlined. It appeared to be a list of official apartments occupied by serving and retired members of the Curia, prepared for the Pope by APSA, the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See. The names of all the cardinal electors who had apartments were underlined. Bellini, 410 square meters, Adeyemi, 480 square meters, Tremblay, 510 square meters. At the foot of the document the Pope had added his own name, the Holy Father, Casa Santa Marta, 50 square meters! Exclamation mark. There was an addendum attached, for the eyes of the Pontiff only. Most Holy Father, as far as we can ascertain, the overall surface area of the APSA patrimony totals 347,532 square meters, with a potential value in excess of 2,700 million euros, but a stated book value of 389,600 million. The shortfall in revenue would appear to indicate a paid occupancy rate of only 56%. It appears, therefore, as Your Holiness suspected, that much of the income is not being properly stated. I have the honour to be Your Holiness's most devoted and obedient child, Di Labriola, Special Commissioner. Lomeli turned to the other pages. Here was his name again. To his astonishment, this time when he looked more closely, he saw it was a summary of his personal bank records with the Vatican Bank, a list of monthly totals going back more than a decade. The most recent entry, for the 30th of September, showed he had a closing balance of €38,734.76. He had not even known the figure himself. It was all the money he had in the world. He ran his eye over the hundreds of names listed. He felt grubby merely reading them, yet he couldn't stop himself. Bellini had €42,112 on deposit. Adeyemi had 121,865, and Tremblay 519,732, a figure that earned another set of papal exclamation marks. Some cardinals had tiny balances. Tedesco's was a mere 2,821, and Benitez seemingly did not have an account at all. But others were rich men. The Archbishop Emeritus of Palermo, Calogero Scutesi, who had worked for a time at the IOR in the days of Marcinkus, and who had actually been investigated for money laundering, was worth 2,643,923. A number of cardinals from Africa and Asia had banked large amounts over the past 12 months. Across one page the Holy Father had scrawled in shaky pencil a quotation from St. Mark's Gospel. Is it not written, My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers? After he'd finished reading, Lamelli rolled up the papers tightly, put them back in the box and closed it. He could taste his disgust, like something rotten on his tongue. The Holy Father had secretly used his authority to obtain his colleagues' private financial records from the IOR. Did he think they were all corrupt? Some of it came as no surprise to him. The scandal of the curial apartments, for example, had been leaked to the press years ago, and the personal wealth of his brother cardinals he'd long suspected. The otherworldly Luciani, who survived as Pope only for a month, was said to have been elected in 1978 because he was the only Italian cardinal who was clean. No, what shook him most at first reading was what the collection revealed about the state of mind of the Holy Father. He pressed the box back into its compartment and replaced the top of the bedpost. The fearful words of the disciples to Jesus came into his mind. This is a lonely place, and the hour is now late. For a few seconds he clung on to the solid wooden upright. He had asked God for guidance, and God had guided him here, and yet he was afraid of what else he might discover. Nevertheless, once he'd calmed himself, he went around the bed to the opposite side of the headboard and checked the beading beneath the carved dome. Here, too, he discovered a hidden lever. The top of a bedpost came away in his hand, and he drew out a second container. Then he went to the foot of the bed and pulled out a third, and then a fourth.